What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, and on this episode, we're going to recap everything Week 4 in the Premier Lacrosse League. We'll recap PLL Player Royale, as well as recapping the picks that we had going into this past weekend in the PLL. We'll also update the power rankings as we do each week here on the podcast, and then finish it all out by getting your thoughts in the mix. So to lead things off here on this show, recapping Week 4, talking some Player Royale and the picks. It was a bit of a tough week in terms of fantasy again this week. You remember back to last week, guys like Jeff Teat and Jake Fricaro didn't do a whole lot for me in fantasy a week ago. Kind of a similar situation again this weekend in Week 4. Had a tough week with Dylan Malloy and Tom Schreiber, netting me a combined 1 point in fantasy. Schreiber especially had a bit of a tough week as a whole, had 2 goals, and I believe I read somewhere on Discord he had about 5 turnovers in that game. So again, a tough week, but overall not too bad. I think I only took like 2 losses for the weekend in terms of my fantasy challenge this weekend. So again, a tough week, but we survived for the most part. And probably the more important thing is, after taking a pretty huge fall in the rankings overall in Player Royale after last week's performance, I was able to at least get back inside the top 20 after this week. So a bit of a plus to take away from this weekend in terms of Player Royale. Obviously, guys like Trevor Baptiste absolutely dominated his matchup, so that did help take some of that sting away as well. And Morocco, even in the loss, that late collapse by the Cannons, he still had, I think it was 16 saves in that one. So again, a pretty solid fantasy performance, from him. And getting into the picks, bounced back kind of similar to Player Royale this week, bounced back a bit with the picks this week after a tough week a week ago. 3-1 in picking game winners as a whole. The chaos, that one that got left behind, really thought this was going to be the weekend that they were able to finally get that first win on the board, but now that gets a little bit more tricky for them as we move forward. The final weekend prior to the All-Star weekend is this next weekend coming up. So again, not totally out of it just yet, which we'll talk about in a second, but definitely that climb getting a little bit steeper for them as the year goes on. And then 2-2 in player props for the weekend as well. So again, kind of bounced back in that respect as well. Not totally there just yet, but a better week, I think, as a whole. And really, who could have seen Tom Schreiber only having 2 goals in that game being as low scoring and sort of a defensive battle as that was? I even think I put in the PLL Discord group, okay, who had this being a defensive battle? Because I think everybody going in thought, man, this game could probably get up to 30 in terms of that total over-under on score. And I think that was really what a lot of us thought going into, was how high is this number really going to go? And it ends up being, 10-9 or whatever it was. So yeah, just never really saw that one as being much of a defensive game. Not that these two teams, the Archers and the Atlas, aren't solid defensive teams, and that Gittleman and Kincannon haven't been having solid years, because they absolutely have been. They are absolutely good defenses for their respective clubs. But again, when you have the kind of offensive firepower that those two teams possess, don't think anybody really saw that game going under 20 points the way that it did. Now, getting to the power rankings here in segment 1 on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Again, we update the power rankings after each and every week in Premier Lacrosse League action. Number 1, so real quick, a side note on these power rankings, by the way, typically in episodes here on the podcast, I'll back up things that I say, statements that I make, with facts and other statistics and things like that. I do the research to make the best informed statements and things that I can possibly provide here on the podcast. But this week, I wanted to go a little more away from that and go more based on the eye test. You talk about, we're 4 games in, we've seen these teams now each for 4 games. We start to kind of see who they really are and what they're really capable of. So this week, I wanted to go more, I guess, based off vibes, if you will, or just the overall eye test, I guess, through 4 games. So number 1, I've got the Whip Snakes. I mean, they're the kings of 1-goal games. I mean, that's been well established at this point in time, not even just this season, but in the last 3.5 seasons in total. I mean, they just find a way to get it done. It's as simple as that. They win no matter what. And I do think, however, they lose a game this year. I don't think we have a 2020 championship series situation where they just run the table and run through everybody in this league on their way to another championship. I do think they lose at least once this year, probably, but they haven't yet, and that's why they're number 1 on this list. Number 2, I have the Chrome, because the Chrome could arguably be number 1 on this list. I don't have a problem with that whatsoever, but they really struggled against the Cannons this weekend until that fourth quarter and overtime, where Brendan Nichtern was the quarterback of that comeback, specifically tallying 4 points between the fourth quarter and overtime in that come from behind win. And the defense looks really good too, with JT Giles Harris really asserting himself as a playmaker on that defense, being sort of that ultimate cover guy where he can take on your top attackman and just be able to go step for step with him for 4 quarters. So again, just a really solid performance so far out of the gate from JT Giles Harris. And Connor Farrell is off to an absolutely hot start this year in the PLL and should be considered for an all-star nomination. I know what guys like Nardella and especially Trevor Baptiste are doing, but you cannot understate what Connor Farrell is doing so far to start this year for the Chrome. And really, he along with Brendan Nichtern really quarterbacked or led the charge of that comeback. I mean, you talk about the last 5-ish minutes of that game in the fourth quarter. Farrell did not lose a faceoff. If he did, he lost maybe 1 or 2, but he was almost automatic at the stripe the last 5 minutes of regulation in that game in order to continue getting that ball to Brendan Nichtern, getting that ball to that offense, and just letting them just start chipping away little by little in that game. Number 3, I've got the Atlas. The Atlas can move past the Chrome with a win head-to-head in Week 5, but for now, I've got them at number 3. The offense has definitely struggled the last 2 weeks against some really strong defenses, but they get another strong defense in the Chrome this weekend. So again, the job for the Atlas doesn't get much easier the rest of the way, especially over their next 3 games, which I'll throw those out there here in just a second. But again, they've gone against 2 really tough defenses in the Whip Snakes and the Archers the last 2 weeks, and then you got another one again in Week 5 in the Chrome. So it'll be interesting to see what version of this Atlas offense we get in Week 5. And the defense, I think, at the other end, and Jack and Cannon have looked so locked in to start this year. I mean, you talk about holding an offense like the Archers to less than 10 is nothing short of amazing, especially considering what they did just a week ago against the Cannons, putting up 20 in that one. And again, Jack Concannon, one of the leaders in the PLL in terms of save percentage. I believe he went something crazy like 65% the week prior against the Whip Snakes and really held the Atlas in that game just about as long as he could. So just an unreal job by the Atlas defense and Jack Concannon to start the year. And that's not even touching on what Trevor Baptiste has been able to do, just playing out of his mind at the stripes so far this year. Dominated that matchup all night against the Archers the other night. And when you see just how good he was, going 19 of 22 at the stripe in that game, it's actually mind-blowing that was only a 1-goal game at the final buzzer. It really felt like, when you look at how the statistics such as shots on goal, face-off wins, things like that, the Atlas dominated like every one of those categories statistically. So how that game was only a 1-goal game, I have absolutely no idea. But again, like I said, for the Atlas, the job doesn't get any easier moving forward, as your next 3 games are the Chrome, the Archers, and the Whip Snakes. So even if you can find a way to go 2-1 in that stretch, I think you're in really good shape moving towards the postseason. Number 4, I've got the Archers. This is where they have been, and I think likely will stay until further notice in the power rankings, because they're a really good team, and they always seem to flirt with 500 as they currently are now, sitting at 2-2. And this team has a lot of talent, but somehow it doesn't always translate, right? It's something, it doesn't seem like it always clicks for them, especially on the offensive side of things, right? To have that kind of talent, to have that kind of firepower, and only to put up less than 10 goals like they did against the Atlas this weekend, it's like something just doesn't always click with this team, especially on that side of the ball. And I'm not sure what it is. I'm not sure what that missing piece to that puzzle is, but they're always just seemingly just something is always off. And then you add to that the fact that they don't have a legit threat at the stripe to get their offense a few more possessions every game. That's something that we talked about before with a team like the Cannons, your ability to get a few more stops on defense or get a few more possessions off the face-off to get that ball to your offense a few more times a game and see what they can do with it, and maybe some of those one-goal games start to go in your favor. That's something that I think hurt the Archers in that game against the Atlas. They had zero ability to beat Trevor Baptiste, and therefore the few possessions that their offense did get became that much more essential to them trying to even hang around in that game. But then you look at the defense, kind of similar to the Atlas. You look at the defense, and the defense has been so strong for them so far this year. With Adam Gittleman in the cage, they've been playing well as a unit. But I think ultimately, again, similar to the Atlas, the offense just needs to be more consistent in order to support that defensive effort, but it also needs to come at the stripe too, with winning more than 3, 4, 5 face-offs in a game. So now the Archers now have Redwoods and Cannons before another matchup with Atlas in a couple weeks. So again, kind of similar to the Archers, or excuse me, the Atlas, the Archers do have a little bit of work to do over their next 3 games. These games aren't necessarily gimmies. The Redwoods could turn it on at any moment. The Cannons will always play you pretty tough no matter how poorly they play, right? They were 5 minutes away from their second win of the year just the other day, and then obviously the Atlas have already shown us what they can do against this Archers offense. Number 5, I've got the Water Dogs, because the Water Dogs started out slow, but finally had their breakout game against the Chaos here in week 4, or maybe that's a bit of an overreaction to beating a team that's now 0-4. It's possible. We just have to kind of wait and see how they do over these next few games, but it seemed like it all started coming together in that game against the Chaos, and Connor Kelly showed that he can still shoot the ball from just about anywhere, as I believe he ended up with 2 or 3 two-pointers in that game. So just an absolute rocket of a shot this weekend against the Chaos, and the defense looked like they are getting back to form, and DeLuca had a really good game actually in cage that night against the Chaos. So again, kind of in that middle ground for the Water Dogs where it can really go either way. This game, that game against the Chaos can sort of be the turning point for their season, or they can drop right back down in these rankings. Number 6, I've got the Redwoods. The Woods could go to number 5 here, but their one win was also against the Chaos, just like the Water Dogs. And I just haven't really quite seen what I'm looking for from them yet. Excuse me. I think that's something that I talked about on last week's episode as well, kind of with the Water Dogs, how I said maybe this weekend was that turning point from them. They kind of showed you something finally. I haven't quite fully seen that yet from the Redwoods, and winning against the Chaos and almost beating the Whipsnakes doesn't really make you a top 5 team in my opinion. And their next 3 games are the Archers, Atlas, and Chaos. So they need, in my opinion, to win 2 of those 3 and show signs of more consistency in order to start to move up this list. Number 7, I've got the Cannons. Now, the Cannons have battled this year as they did much of last year, but only have a week 1 win over the Water Dogs to show for their effort, which is, like I said, kind of reminiscent of 2021, just being so close in so many games, those 1-goal games, but just can't figure out a way to come out on the other end of it. And again, they absolutely blew it in that 4th quarter against the Chrome. They had the game in hand, but they allowed the Chrome to sort of hang around and hang around and hang around until all of a sudden, oh, it's overtime, and the Chrome come back and win. And you talk about more specifically, they were 2 minutes away. They were up by 4 with about 2 minutes to go in that game until Connor Farrell couldn't lose a face-off seemingly the rest of the game. And the Chrome played make it, take it for about 5 minutes in that final 5 minutes of the fourth quarter. And one bright spot for sure for this Cannons team going forward is that Lyle Thompson and Asher Nolting have been fantastic, to say the least, offensively. But similar to the Atlas, the midfield has to provide help at some point in time. You talk about the Atlas, their shooting percentages are scary low. You talk about a guy like Costabile below 10%, Romar Dennis below 10%, Brendan Curry below 10%. They brought in Jake Carraway to try and provide some help this weekend. He goes 0 for 5 shooting. So similarly that to the Cannons is that those two guys, Lyle and Asher Nolting, can only do so much for you before the midfield has to start producing at some point in time. And then number 8, I've got the Chaos, because we can never really count out the Chaos, as Andy Towers and this team have shown us the past 2 years. And you almost want to believe that Andy Towers has us right where he wants us, with that sort of 3% mentality ringing a bell from last season, where they had a 3% chance of winning the championship and then they go out and actually do it. So like I said, they almost have us right where they want us, but they've had winnable games up to this point, even despite not having those NLL guys present up until week 4, and they just haven't been able to get it done so far this year, and now sit as the lone winless team in the PLL. So it's not over. Something I talked about in the open to the show, it's not necessarily over. The season's not over yet, but that window is definitely closing fast if they go into the All-Star break as a winless team. So coming up in segment 2, we'll round out the show, get your thoughts in the mix, recapping week 4 in the PLL. You're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Welcome back. Final segment of the show here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Get your thoughts in the mix to round out our show, recapping week 4 in the PLL. At Stevie Mack Media is my Twitter handle for all show related and PLL related content and discussions. From Brian on Twitter, he says, the Whipsnakes do what they do best, and that's win 1-goal games. The Water Dogs with the most impressive win of the weekend. The Atlas Oak continues to be feast or famine. Chrome continues to be the most impressive team, while the Cannons still looking for anything from their midfield. So yeah, just to kind of break these down each one by one, the Whipsnakes do what they do best and win 1-goal games. Yeah, and it's like I said in the opening, they're number 1 right now because they're one of the 2 4-0 teams, but they consistently find a way to win those games. Just like Brian says, win those 1-goal games when the game is on the line and a play needs to be made. More often than not, somebody in a Whipsnakes uniform is going to be the one that makes it happen, whether it's Rambo, whether it's Zed, whether it's Jay Carlson, whoever it is. Somebody in a Whipsnakes uniform is typically the one that gets it done. The Water Dogs with the most impressive win of the weekend. Yeah, I mean, again, NLL guys are not for the Chaos winning the way that they did. Connor Kelly having the game that he did. DeLuca having the game that he did in the cage for that Water Dogs defense. Yeah, that was an all-around impressive win. You can argue maybe the Atlas game over the Archers and what they were able to do to that Archers defense. But again, the offense didn't look particularly great. Jeff Teat did have that one highlight play with the one-handed goal and things like that. So you can maybe argue the Atlas and the Archers game being one of the more electric games because of how tight that was the whole night. But I definitely think the most impressive win, Brian is right, would have to be the Water Dogs, and just the way that they dominated from one end of the field to the other from start to finish. He says the Atlas O continues to be feast or famine. Yeah, this is kind of one of those similar situations to the Archers, where you have so many talented guys on that offensive unit that it's hard to understand how they're not scoring 10, 12, 13, 14 plus goals on any given night, because of just how good we know these guys are when it is in fact clicking. And especially when Trevor Baptiste goes out there and wins you almost 20 faceoffs in one game. How is that game not tilted in your favor almost entirely. How do you not win by 5, 6, 7 goals in a way that the Water Dogs win? How do you only win that game by 1 goal? He says the Chrome continues to be the most impressive team while the Cannons still look for anything from their midfield. Yeah, and to talk about the Cannons thing first, that goes back to the Atlas thing, is when you have the kind of offense that they have, especially at attack with guys like Teat, Law, and Gray, and you know what they're capable of, you can't have multiple midfielders on your offensive unit shooting below 10%. And I know guys like Costabile, defenses are being more aggressive to him. They're throwing doubles. They're sliding and switching a lot faster to him when he's on the ball. They're not letting him just dodge where he wants to get with the ball and be able to make plays the way that we know he can, and be sort of a facilitator from that midfield the way that we know that he can. But you got to be able to do something offensively, schematically, to try and free him up. I don't know if it's using a guy like John Crawley to work some 2-man games with him, maybe try to get him matched up on a short stick. One thing they did do, not necessarily with Costabile, but one thing I did notice the Atlas did in that game against the Archers was at one point in time, I'm not sure at what point in the game we were at when this happened, but back-to-back possessions, they carried a short stick to X and attacked that matchup specifically. I don't think they necessarily converted on those looks, but it was something that really caught my attention, was that on multiple possessions in a row, they carried a short stick to X. Maybe that's something they need to do with Costabile, is have him carry that short stick, if he gets a short stick on him, to X and try to attack that matchup one-on-one and try to create something from there. That could be a possibility. But as far as him saying the Chrome continues to be the most impressive team, yeah, I said it in the power rankings. You have every right, I guess you could say, or every case that you could make to have the Chrome number 1 ahead of the Whipsnakes, because I do think that in a lot of ways they have been one of the more solid teams overall from defense to attack and so on throughout the first 4 games of this season. I have no problem with saying that the Chrome are the number 1 team in the league right now and should be number 1 in the power rankings. And then, and like I said with the Cannons, just finding anything from that midfield. You talk about guys like Asher Knowlton, you talk about guys like Lyle Thompson, Ryan Drenner, whoever it is down there at attack, but when you have guys like Jake Furcaro struggling the way he is, and just that midfield in general struggling the way they are, you have to start wondering, what do they need to do in order to get that offensive midfield going? I know I got a little bit off topic talking about the Atlas midfield in comparison to the Cannons offensive midfield, but you look at that midfield, is it something schematically that they need to do to start giving these guys more opportunities to get looks at the cage and be more efficient offensively? Is there somebody in the player pool that they could target to try and bring some life into this offensive midfield unit? That's something that we'll have to watch for moving forward. But yeah, the Cannons and the Atlas, I think specifically, and you could probably say the Redwoods too, are a couple teams that have really struggled from their offensive midfield so far to start the year. So it'll be interesting to see how those teams sort of address those struggles moving forward. From Michael Ramirez, he says, this Chrome team has no quit. Cannons crumble late. Whips still own the woods. Water Dogs go off, but Chaos still can't be counted on. Atlas defense is locked in, and Baptiste dominates the face-off X over the Archers, who need more out of the face-off. So yeah, again, just to take these one by one, again, the Chrome have absolutely no quit. They're that team that they're going to play you for 4 quarters, and you have to play the full 4 quarters, and that's something the Cannons learned the hard way this weekend, is that you can't just coast to those last 5 minutes. That's why things like score differential matters in this league. You talk about when you're even up by 4 or 5 goals, whatever it is, you hear guys like Ryan Boyle say it all the time. I wouldn't mind seeing them get one more here, because you never know if that one more goal is going to help you or hurt you when it comes to playoff time. So yeah, the Chrome showed you have to play them for a full 4 quarters, because they're going to take you all the way till the end. He says the Whips still own the Woods. Yeah, I mean, ever since that first matchup where the Woods won against the Whipsnake, it's pretty much been all Whipsnakes since then. I know they're usually 1 or 2 goal games, as we've seen in the past. You talk about the game this weekend. You talk about the championship game in 2019 was that overtime winner for the Whipsnakes. You talk about the 2020 championship series where the Whipsnakes again win in overtime. I believe that was a semifinal game. So yeah, they're generally close games, but ever since that first game where the Redwoods took that first one, it's pretty much been all Whipsnakes since then. He says, Water Dogs go off, but chaos still can't be counted on. Yeah, the Water Dogs, I think, finally had their wake-up moment where things finally started to click for them. Take that for what it is against a team that is 0-4 now, I guess, but you also kind of feel like maybe this was that point similar to last year where they finally get one and then they start to really turn it on mid-season. He says, Atlas defense is locked in, and Baptiste dominates the faceoff X. Yeah, that was one of the more impressive defensive performances that I've seen from this Atlas defense as a whole under Ken Clausen. I mean, again, you talk about names like Will Manny, Marcus Holman, Tom Schreiber. You didn't hear a whole lot of them during that broadcast, except for when the guys were talking and saying, yeah, we haven't called their name much tonight. So even they were acknowledging that those guys were having an off night because of what the Atlas were able to do. And one thing that they mentioned was that there wasn't a lot of sliding going on by the Atlas defense. It was, hey, we're going to play you one-on-one. We're just going to rely on each guy to win their individual matchup. You have to try and beat us one-on-one. And the Archers showed that for much of that game, outside of maybe Matt Moore having a couple solid looks on Kincannon, that they couldn't really do that for the most part. And then, yeah, anytime you go 19 for 22 at the stripe, I don't care who it's against. You go 19 of 22 at the stripe, you should be like first ballot all-star in terms of Trevor Baptiste and what he's done to start this season. And then he says, we need more. The Archers need more out of the face-off. Yeah, I get that they're a bit inexperienced in terms of the pro level at the stripe this year with what they're putting out there, guys like Justin Inacio, etc. But if they want to have a chance moving forward as the season goes along and they want to be in that top 4 as those top 4 teams go to that championship series next year, they need to get more out of the faceoff, because it doesn't really matter how good your offense is if they never have the ball, because a guy like Trevor Baptiste is going 19 for 22 against you week in and week out. Do I think that's a weekly occurrence for this Archers team? No, I don't expect it to be that abysmal for them each week, but it just makes the offense have to work that much harder to try and be as efficient as possible, knowing that there's a very solid chance that even if you score on this possession, you're probably not getting that ensuing faceoff. So that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. You can also find the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, including Google, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Stitcher, just to name several of those platforms just by searching Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.